Eclipse Motion. Motion Pictures.
26 years after for break tenagens, fierce survived a killer in a ghost face mask. The One Wins family came back home in June 2026. Scary Movie 6 of Silly Just Title Scary Movie. Each 30s worldwide and did something almost nobody nobody expected from a spoof franchise that had been dormant for 13 years. Each won the week break box office records and got the entire internet arguing. Some people called it the finest touch experience that had all earth. Others called it tragedy, slooping, and stuck it to pets. Both groups were loud, and both groups were right about something. In this video, we are going to wake through the really picture. Where this movie came from? What is this actually paradox with the box office number match so much for a mid-budget comedy in 2026.
Let's start with the moment that made this whole comeback possible. Because Scary Movie in 2026 did not sneak into theaters quietly, it kicked the door down. The film opened to more than $105 million worldwide in a single weekend, with roughly 55 to 56 million of that coming from North America and another 50 million from international markets spread across more than 50 countries. For a comedy that cost only $30 million to make, that is not just a good opening. That is a number that rewrites what people thought was possible for a studio comedy in the middle of the 2020s. An era when mid-budget films outside of horror and superhero franchises have struggled to get people into theaters at all. To put it in context, the domestic opening beat the previous best debut in the entire Scary Movie series, which belonged to the fourth film back in 2006 with under $50 million. IT also cool. Scream sequel. The very franchise this movie spends a huge amount of its runtime making fun of. There is something almost poetic about a parody outgrossing its own biggest target in the same calendar year. So why did this happen now? The short answer is nostalgia mixed with timing. The Scary Movie franchise began in the year 2000. Created by the Wayans family alongside a team of writers, and it became a genuine cultural phenomenon almost overnight, mocking the wave of self-aware slasher movies that dominated the late 90s. The first film was a surprise smash, one of the biggest R-rated openings of its era, and it turned for relatively unknown young performers Anna Faris, Regina Hall, Marlon Wayans, and Sean Wayans into recognizable names. A second film followed a year later. But that was the last time the original Wayans creative team was fully involved for a very long time. The franchise continued without them, cycling through different casts, different writers, and a noticeably different tone all the way up through a fifth entry in 2013. That fifth movie is generally remembered as the low point of the series, both critically and in terms of how audiences responded to it. After that, the franchise essentially went dark. No sequel, no reboot, nothing for 13 years. That gap is important because it means an entire generation grew up only knowing Scary Movie is something their older siblings or parents talked about, a meme referenced in group chats. A title that shows up on late-night cable, rather than something actively happening in theaters. So when word got out that Miramax was financing a true legacy sequel, one that would bring back not just the original cast, but the original writing team of Marlon, Sean, and Keenan Ivory Wayans working together again for the first time since that second film in 2001. It created a wave of curiosity that a simple reboot never could have. This was being sold, correctly, as a genuine reunion. Adding another layer to that, the marketing leaned hard into that reunion angle, and by most accounts it worked. The studio's own leadership has publicly compared the scale of the campaign to some of the biggest franchise marketing pushes they have ever worked on, and whether or not you buy that comparison at face value, the trailer's viral spread speaks for itself. The first teaser played in front of another major horror sequel earlier in the year, and then went online, quickly becoming one of the most talked about comedy trailers of the season, to the point that is a rare thing in the modern release calendar, where dates are usually locked in more than a year ahead of time, and rarely move for anything short of a major scheduling conflict. Now let's talk about what the movie is actually about, because the plot, while thin by design, does a decent job of giving the cast something to bounce off of. The film opens with a clever bit of misdirection. We see what looks like a fairly standard slasher opening, complete with a masked killer showing up at a door. Except it turns out we are watching a movie within the movie, a fictional parody film that a teenage character is watching on her couch. That character dismisses parody movies as outdated, and says she prefers what she calls elevated horror, specifically referencing the recent Scream films. It is a knowing, slightly cheeky way for the, almost as punishment for her comment, the real masked killer shows up at her actual door. From there the story widens out to a small ensemble of new, younger characters connected to the returning cast. Vanhoff Brenda, Meeks' now teenage children, is politically outspoken in a way that draws jokes about generational culture clashes, while her brother is dating a young woman their mother disapproves of. A family friend brings his teenage son, who is trans, into the story as well, setting up several jokes that lean directly into current online discourse around identity and generational politics. Meanwhile, another young character works at a horror-themed amusement park where the rides start malfunctioning and killing people in scenes clearly built to spoof the Final Destination franchise's elaborate death sequences. All of these threads eventually tangle together around the central mystery of who is behind the mask this time, structured very deliberately as an homage to, and send-up of, the two most recent Scream films, which themselves were built around legacy characters mentoring a new generation of leads That structural choice, borrowing the exact bones of the current Scream trilogy rather than the original 90s slashers the first. Scary Movie was built on, is one of the smartest decisions the writers made, even if not every critic gave them credit for it. It lets the film comment on something very current and very real, which is Hollywood's obsession with what people now call the legacy sequel or the recal, a movie that brings back original stars specifically to hand the story off to a younger cast while flattering longtime fans with callbacks. Scream, Halloween, Ghostbusters, and plenty of other franchises have all done a version of this in the last several years. And by mimicking that exact formula, Scary Movie gets to poke fun at describing its heroes cutting through, in its words, reboots, remakes, recals, prequels, sequels, spin-offs, elevated horror origin stories, and anything with the word legacy in the title. That is not subtle, but subtlety was never really the point of this franchise. Beyond that central Scream skeleton, the film functions almost like a highlight reel of the last several years of horror cinema. And this is genuinely where a lot of the sharpest material lives. The screenplay pulls from an unusually wide and current pool of targets. There is an extended sequence spoofing Sinners, the acclaimed vampire drama from the previous year, including a bit built around the film's big musical church scene and another built around its tense sequence of vampires waiting to be let inside a juke joint. There is material aimed at Get Out, using its social commentary as a launching pad for the film's own jokes about race and awkward interactions. The substance gets a body horror send up, in one especially memorable and grotesque gag that ties back to an entirely different Wayans franchise by having a monstrous transformation reference their earlier comedy White Chicks, which is the kind of self-referential family brand humor you can really only get away with when the people making the joke also made the thing being referenced. Weapons and M3 can both get shorter, punchier riffs. A Quiet Place gets a silent space sequence built for maximum slapstick payoff. And then, in one of the more talked about behind-the-scenes stories, a sequence spoofing Terrifier and its violent clown villain, involving an exaggerated mall set piece, was reportedly removed, which tells you a lot about how the filmmakers were actively negotiating the line between the franchise's traditionally shock-driven humor and what a modern studio release can actually put on screen in wide theatrical release. Interestingly, the production team pushed the parody targets right up to the edge of the release date itself. Principal photography wrapped in late 2025. But because the film is built entirely around being current, the crew reportedly returned for additional shooting in early 2026 specifically to add parodies of horror movies that had not even been released yet when the main shoot finished, folding in fresh material about films that came out only months, or in some cases weeks, before Scary Movie itself hit theaters. That is an unusually aggressive production strategy for a studio comedy, and it explains why the finished film feels less like a movie made a year or two ago and more like something assembled right up until the last possible moment, chasing whatever was actually trending in horror at the exact time people would be sitting in the theater. The film does not stop with its horror movie targets, either. It also throws in glancing references to broader pop culture moments, completely outside the horror genre, including at least one joke reef which some reviewers pointed to as an example of the film spreading itself a little too thin, chasing internet relevance in every direction instead of staying locked onto its central story. And then there are the two scenes that play during the credits, both of which function as standalone gags rather than sequel setup. One is a fake trailer for a film parodying the 2020 for gothic horror hit that reimagined a very old vampire story. Dressed up here with a comedic title built as a pun on Brother and the original film's name. The other spoofs the tense, unsettling interrogation scene from a different, acclaimed 2020 for horror film involving a mysterious, unsettling character, restaging it with one of the film's returning comic. Neither of these scenes teases a seventh entry, which is itself a small, dry joke about how modern blockbusters almost always dangle a sequel hook, whether they have actually been greenlit for one or not. Now let's get into the reception, because this is where the story of Scary Movie in 2026 gets genuinely interesting. And honestly, it is the part that says the most about where comedy sits in the culture right now. Critics were not kind. The film landed in the 20–30% range on the major review aggregator, depending on exactly when you check the number, which places it roughly in line with, or slightly better than, some of the weaker entries earlier in the franchise. Though notably still behind the original film's score from the year 2000, the specific complaints from critics were fairly consistent across different outlets. Reviewers frequently pointed to outdated humor, jokes that felt like they were written for an earlier decade, an over-reliance on drug references that felt more like nostalgia for the franchise's old comedic style than anything fresh, and pacing problems caused by the sheer number of targets the script tries to hit. More than one reviewer specifically wished the film had trusted its central scream parody more and spent less time chasing tangential internet references. There was also a recurring complaint that the two returning female leads, Anna Faris and Regina Hall, whose chemistry together is genuinely one of the most fondly remembered elements of the earlier films, were underused this time around, sidelined in favor of the newer, younger cast members carrying more of the plot. One review summed up the film's overall approach by describing it essentially as a string of pop culture in-jokes stitched together, meaning its success or failure lives or dies entirely on how funny each individual sketch happens to be rather than on any real narrative momentum, which is a fair description of the entire Scary Movie formula going back to the very first film, for better and for worse. But then you look at how actual audiences responded, and it is almost a completely different movie. On the same review aggregator, the audience score sits dramatically higher than the critics' score. Reading through audience comments, a clear pattern emerges that has nothing to do with technical filmmaking and everything to do with pure emotional release. People kept describing the experience in very similar terms, laughing until it physically hurt. Needing this kind of comedy specifically because the world outside the theater has felt heavy and stressful lately. Appreciating a movie that lets everyone, across every group the film pokes fun at, laugh at themselves without it feeling mean-spirited. Several viewers specifically praised the film for staying true to the tone of the original to movies rather than trying to reinvent itself. And multiple comments framed the film's willingness to make jokes about sensitive, currently contested topics as a feature rather than a flaw. Something they said felt refreshingly bold in a comedy landscape that many viewers feel has become overly cautious. That divide, Cautious critics worry of dated or edgy material versus audiences who specifically wanted something unfiltered. Is really the entire story of this movie's reception in one sentence. It is worth pointing out that this critic-audience split is not new territory for this specific franchise. Every single scary movie film has drawn a version of this same reaction. The original film from 2000 sits at just over 50% with critics, already a mixed reception even at its most successful. The second film dropped sharply. The third and fourth films landed in the mid-30s. And the fifth film, the one made without the Wayans family's full involvement, hit rock bottom with critics almost universally panning it. Across nearly every one of those entries, audience scores have consistently sat noticeably higher than critic scores, meaning this franchise has essentially always operated as a critic-proof property, something built for a specific kind of movie-going experience. Noir, communal, un prétentieux rather than staged claim. The sixth film simply continues that exact pattern, just at a much larger commercial scale than the franchise has seen in over a decade. So what does that gap actually tell us? I think it tells us something real about what people are showing up to theaters for right now. In the middle of a summer packed with expensive franchise films chasing award season prestige, even inside genre filmmaking, Scary Movie is not trying to be elevated horror. And it is not trying to be a clever meta-commentary in the way something like a recent, more restrained horror satire might be. It is trying to be the loudest, silliest thing in the room. And based on the opening weekend numbers and the audience score, a huge number of people wanted exactly that. There is also a demographic story hiding inside the box office data that is worth flagging. Reports on the opening weekend breakdown showed Hispanic and Latino audiences making up the largest single share of the domestic crowd, followed closely by white and then black moviegoers, with the under 35 age bracket driving the overwhelming majority of ticket sales. That is a meaningfully younger and more diverse opening weekend audience than a lot of major studio releases pull in. And it suggests the marketing campaign, especially its heavy presence on social platforms and its choice to dub jokes into local languages for international markets, rather than simply subtitling them, genuinely connected with audiences the traditional prestige comedy circuit tends to overlook. That international performance deserves its own moment, because it is arguably the more surprising part of the whole story. The overseas opening came in dramatically higher than any previous Scary Movie film's international debut. By a wide margin, something the studio has directly credited to that localized dubbing strategy. Actually translating and adapting the jokes for different markets rather than relying on subtitles that often flatten comedic timing and cultural references. The film topped the box office charts in a striking number of individual countries during its opening weekend, including strong #1 debuts in Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Brazil, plus record-setting Paramount openings in a couple of Latin American markets specifically. For a comedy franchise that is, at its core, deeply rooted in very specific American pop culture references, that level of international success is not something you would automatically expect. And it speaks well of the adaptation work the studio put into rolling this film out globally rather than treating it as a strictly domestic play. It is also worth walking through the shape of that opening weekend day by day, because the pattern tells its own story. Friday numbers came in extremely strong. Strong enough that some early industry trackers speculated the film might climb all the way towards $60 million domestically by the time Sunday numbers were counted. Instead, the daily numbers gradually cooled as the weekend went on, landing the final domestic tally closer to the mid-50 million range, instead of that higher projection. That kind of front-loaded pattern, a huge Friday followed by a softer Saturday and Sunday, is often a signal that a film's audience skews heavily toward its most dedicated, built-in fanbase rushing out on day one, rather than a broader wave of casual moviegoers discovering it gradually across the weekend through word of mouth. It is not necessarily a bad sign on its own. Plenty of successful franchise films front-load Sci-Fi, but combined with that softer-than-hoped exit poll grade mentioned earlier, it does paint a picture of a film that captured its core audience efficiently and immediately, without yet proving it could expand much beyond the base in the days that followed. Even so, the film comfortably held on to the top spot at the box office that weekend, beating out a considerably more expensive new release built around a well-known toy and animation property, which opened well behind projections relative to its reported budget of roughly $200 million. A gap that became its own separate story in trade press coverage that same week. Sitting at number one ahead of a release with nearly 7 times its budget is a genuinely strong showing, and it reinforced the broader industry point already mentioned earlier. That efficient, nostalgia-driven mid-budget comedies can outperform far more expensive films when the underlying concept resonates with audiences. Now, no discussion of this movie's opening weekend would be complete without acknowledging the warning sign sitting right inside the data too. The film reportedly earned a C+ grade from opening night audience exit polling, a metric that studios watch closely because it tends to predict how steeply a film will drop in its second weekend. And sure enough, some of the very earliest tracking suggested a significant decline was already shaping up for the film's second week in release. A C+ is not a disaster by any means, but for a broad studio comedy hoping for strong word of mouth to carry it deeper into the summer, it is a noticeably soft grade, and it lines up almost perfectly with the critical concerns about pacing and inconsistent jokes. In other words, the same structural issues that bothered critics. Too many targets, uneven joke density, underused veteran cast members appear to have limited how far positive word of mouth could actually travel once the opening weekend's built-in nostalgia audience had already bought their tickets. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about what this whole comeback means in a bigger industry context, because I think that is honestly the most interesting part of this story. For years now, there has been a real conversation across the entertainment industry about whether mid-budget comedies can even survive in modern theatrical release anymore. Streaming platforms absorbed a huge chunk of what used to be theatrical comedy output. Studios shifted their theatrical bets almost entirely towards superhero movies, big-budget franchise sequels, and horror, because horror remains one of the few genres that reliably brings in a profit relative to its budget. Scary Movie sits at a fascinating intersection of all of that. It is technically a horror-adjacent release, riding the coattails of the genre's box office reliability, while actually delivering a straight comedy experience. And it did so on a genuinely modest $30 million budget, meaning the studio was already profitable within days of release. That combination, Low financial risk plus a built-in nostalgia audience plus a genre wrapper that theater chains and audiences already trust. Might be one of the more replicable success stories to come out of the 2026 box office calendar. And do not be surprised if other dormant comedy franchises take notice. There is also a very direct ripple effect already playing out. Marlon Wayans has publicly connected this film's box office performance to the future of another one of the family's franchises, teasing that the long-rumored sequel to their earlier hit comedy might finally move forward as a direct result of Scary Movie proving there is still a real commercial appetite for the family's specific brand of humor. Whether or not that sequel actually gets greenlit, the fact that industry conversations are already treating this film's opening as a bellwether for greenlighting other legacy comedy projects tells you how closely Hollywood is watching this particular experiment. Before we move on, it is worth pausing on where this franchise actually sits inside the history of comedy filmmaking. Because Scary Movie did not just make a spoof movie back in 2000. It more or less invented an entire commercial category almost by accident. Before that first film, horror parody existed here and there. But nothing had proven it could be a reliable, repeatable box office engine. Once the original became a hit, it opened the floodgates for an entire wave of genre spoof comedies across the following decade. Films that borrowed the exact same formula of stringing together recognizable scenes from recent blockbusters and running them through absurd, lowbrow gags. Some of those films came from entirely different studios and creative teams chasing the same commercial lightning, with mixed results. And by the middle of the 2010s, the whole subgenre had largely burned itself out through overuse and diminishing quality. That collapse is actually part of why this sixth film's success feels so notable. It is not just reviving one franchise, it is reviving an entire style of filmmaking that the industry had quietly written off as exhausted. Whether that leads to a broader resurgence of genre spoof comedy across other studios remains to be seen. But the commercial numbers here certainly give other studios a reason to at least consider dusting off their own dormant parody properties. It also helps to remember that the Wayans family's comedic sensibility did not begin with this franchise either. Long before the first Scary Movie, Keenan Ivory Wayans built an entire, influential sketch comedy show that helped launch several major comedic careers, establishing a house style built around fearless, rapid-fire parody of pop culture and media tropes. A style that clearly carried directly into this franchise's DNA. That same sensibility later showed up again in the family's other film work, including a broad comedy built around two undercover characters disguised as wealthy socialites, which became a cult favorite in its own right and which, as mentioned earlier, actually gets a direct callback inside this new film's body horror sequence. Understanding that throughline helps explain why so many of the specific jokes in Scary Movie land the way they do for longtime fans, and why other jokes land completely flat for newer viewers who have no context for the reference being made. This film is, in a very real sense, in conversation with the entire body of work this family has built over more than 3 decades. Not just with the 5 previous entries carrying this particular title. Let's talk more specifically about the cast, because that is really the emotional core of why this film worked commercially even when the script itself drew criticism. Anna Faris and Regina Hall reuniting on screen together carries real weight for anyone who grew up on the earlier films. their comedic chemistry, the way Ferris leaned into Oblivious. Over-the-top physical comedy while whole-grounded scenes with sharper, more cutting delivery was one of the defining dynamics of the entire franchise's original run. And by most accounts, whenever the two of them actually share screen time in this new film, it still clicks. That is exactly why the complaint about them being underused stings as much as it does among longtime fans and several critics. If the chemistry is still there and reviewers agree that it is, then every minute spent instead on newer, less familiar characters can feel, to a certain segment of the audience, like time taken away from the very thing that made people nostalgic for this franchise in the first place. Marlon and Sean Wayans, meanwhile, get to do what they have always done best in this series, rapid-fire physical comedy, breaking the fourth wall, leaning into exaggeration far past the point of realism. And by all accounts they slide right back into those roles comfortably. The newer additions to the cast are where opinions split more sharply. Some reviewers appreciated the attempt to build out a genuine next generation of characters rather than just wheeling the original out for a victory lap, drawing a direct comparison to how the recent Scream films successfully balanced legacy characters with new leads. Others felt the newer characters, several of whom are explicitly built around very current identity-based jokes involving generational politics, gender identity, and online discourse, will not age well. The same criticism that, ironically, has been leveled at almost every scary movie sequel since the franchise began, going all the way back to jokes in the earlier films that reference celebrities and trends from their own specific era that now read as pretty dated in hindsight. That is sort of the built-in trade-off of this entire genre of comedy. Reference-based humor generates enormous impact in the moment, driving exactly the kind of social media buzz that turned this film's trailer into a viral moment. But that same specificity is also what causes older entries in reference-based comedy franchises to feel stale a few years down the road. The filmmakers clearly know this trade-off and chose immediate cultural relevance over long-term shelf life, which lines up with a comment one of the Wayans brothers gave in an interview before release, essentially saying the whole point of this franchise has always been to make everyone laugh, regardless of how sensitive any particular audience member might be, arguing that even people who consider themselves sensitive still need permission to laugh at themselves sometimes. You can agree or disagree with that philosophy, but it is a consistent, deliberate approach rather than an accident. It is worth spending a moment on the supporting cast too, because part of what makes this reunion feel genuine rather than a surface-level cash grab is how many of the smaller, oddball characters from the original two films actually came back rather than being recast or quietly written out. The friend group's collection of side characters, the sleazy would-be boyfriend, the loyal but perpetually unlucky best friend, and the strange, socially awkward neighbor whose entire comedic identity is built around unsettling behavior, all return with the same performers who originated them a quarter of a century ago. And that continuity matters more than it might seem. A big part of what makes legacy sequels work or fail is whether the returning faces feel like an afterthought bolted onto new material, or whether they feel woven back into the fabric of the story in a way that respects what made them memorable the first time. By most accounts, this film leans toward the latter, giving these familiar faces small but recognizable Beats that reward longtime viewers without requiring an encyclopedic knowledge of the earlier films to still find funny. On top of the returning legacy cast, the film also stacks its supporting roster with a wide range of newer comedic and celebrity cameos, adding names from television sketch comedy, professional sports, and music into smaller supporting or cameo roles. That kind of cameo-heavy casting strategy is a long-standing tradition for this franchise specifically, going back to celebrity cameos in earlier entries that became some of the most quoted moments in the whole series. And it also doubles as a savvy marketing tool, since each recognizable face pulled into the cast brings along their own fan base and their own reason to talk about the movie online. There was even some pre-release buzz around a major music star reportedly being offered a role and ultimately deciding not to take it. The kind of casting rumor that keeps a film's name circulating in entertainment coverage for weeks before release without costing the studio anything in additional marketing spend. Let's also talk about the technical side of things for a moment, because a parody film like this lives or dies on craft choices that are easy to overlook. Director Michael Titus, who has a long history working with Marlon Wayans on several of his other comedy projects, brings a visual style here that closely mimics the exact look and camera language of whatever film is currently being spoofed in a given scene, which is a harder trick to pull off well than it sounds. Good parody filmmaking is not just about writing a funny joke, it is about recreating the specific cinematography, color grading, and blocking of the source material closely enough that the audience immediately recognizes what is being mocked before a single line of dialogue is even spoken. And by most accounts, this film succeeds at that visual mimicry more consistently than it succeeds at joke density in its script. The production design team clearly did their homework on recent horror aesthetics, from the cold clinical look associated with recent psychological horror hits to the warm, atmospheric period lighting used in last year's acclaimed vampire drama, and translating those very different visual languages convincingly across a single 90-something minute runtime is a genuinely difficult production challenge that the film pulls off more gracefully than its uneven script. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the thematic layer running underneath all the slapstick and gross-out gags, because I think this is the part of the movie that gets lost when people only talk about it in terms of individual jokes landing or not landing. At its heart, this film is making an argument about repetition in modern Hollywood. Every single franchise it spoofs, the endless Scream sequels, the constant stream of legacy sequels dragging original stars back for one more round, the flood of recalls that are not quite reboots and not quite direct sequels, is itself a symptom of an industry that has become extremely risk-averse. One that would rather resurrect something familiar than greenlight something new, by building its entire structure around mimicking that exact formula, bringing the original cast back to hand things off to a younger generation. Scary Movie is not just mocking individual horror movies, it is mocking the entire economic logic of how modern blockbuster franchises get made in the first place. And there is a real irony sitting right at the center of that argument, because this film is itself precisely that kind of legacy sequel. It is bringing back an original cast and an original creative team specifically to capitalize on nostalgia for a beloved earlier era of the franchise. The film seems to be at least somewhat aware of that irony, given how directly its own marketing synopsis leans into mocking the concept of legacy sequels while being one. Whether you read that as clever self-awareness, or as a slightly hollow bit of K-candy tit-to positioning probably depends a lot on how charitably you already feel toward the franchise going in. There is another layer worth pulling out here too, which is the film's relationship with the horror genre it is spoofing more broadly. A lot of what critics call elevated horror, the more artistically ambitious, socially conscious, slower-paced style of horror filmmaking that has become a dominant force in the genre over roughly the last decade, gets specifically singled out by this film's own opening scene, where a teenage character explicitly prefers what she calls elevated horror over parody films, only to be attacked by the actual masked killer moments later. That is the film making a pointed argument in its very first scene, essentially saying that no matter how prestigious or artistically respected horror filmmaking becomes, there will always be an audience appetite for the messier, sillier, more communal experience of watching people scream and then laugh together in a crowded theater. Given how well this film's opening weekend numbers actually performed, especially against genuinely well-reviewed horror competition also in theaters at the same time, you could argue the box office results themselves back up that argument better than any line of dialogue in the script could. It is worth taking a step back and looking at the actual state of horror filmmaking that this movie is reacting to, because the genre it is spoofing has changed dramatically since the last Scary Movie came out 13 years earlier. Back in 2013, horror was still largely dominated by found footage films and haunted house franchises built around jump scares and low production budgets. By the time this sixth film went into production, the genre had shifted toward what critics broadly call elevated horror, slower, more artistically ambitious films dealing with grief, trauma, identity, and social commentary, alongside a parallel boom in legacy slasher sequels bringing back decades-old franchises with new casts. That is an enormous stylistic range to spoof within a single 90-something minute film, covering everything from a quiet, meditative story about a mysterious killer's childhood trauma to a loud, splatter-heavy franchise built around a violent clown to a somber, socially conscious vampire period piece, to a glossy science fiction thriller about a killer robotic doll. Very few genres change shape as quickly as horror has over the last decade. And the fact that this film attempts to cover essentially the entire spectrum, from art house adjacent psychological horror all the way to gross out splatter, is genuinely ambitious, even if, as multiple critics pointed out, that ambition sometimes comes at the cost of focus. That range also explains part of why audience reactions varied so much, depending on which specific sequences a given viewer connected with most. Someone who primarily follows big legacy franchises might find the Scream structural parody the most satisfying part of the film, since it is the through line holding the whole plot together. Someone who is more plugged into award season horror might get more out of the vampire drama sequence or the psychological thriller riffs, since those recreate very specific, recent, critically acclaimed imagery. And someone who just wants broad, over-the-top gross-out comedy will probably gravitate toward the more chaotic, splatter-heavy set pieces, including the clown-centered mall sequence that nearly got cut entirely, because the film is trying to serve all three of those audiences within the same runtime. No single viewer is likely to find every sequence equally satisfying. which helps explain the wide range of individual audience reactions circulating online, from people calling specific scenes the funniest thing they have seen in years to others calling those same scenes the weakest part of the movie. It is also worth addressing directly and fairly the material built around generational and identity-based humor, since that is one of the more debated elements of the film across both critical reviews and audience discussion. The screenplay leans on the newer, younger characters to carry jokes about generational culture clashes, contrasting an older generation's assumptions with how younger characters describe themselves. A girlfriend character who pushes back against being judged by an older relative, and a family friend's teenage son who is transgender. Depending on who you ask, that material lands very differently. Some viewers and reviewers found these jokes sharp and observational, arguing they are simply doing what this franchise has always done, taking whatever is currently part of the cultural conversation and running it through the film's exaggerated comedic lens, the same way earlier entries mocked whatever was culturally dominant in their own eras. Other viewers and critics found the same material uneven, arguing that some of the jokes rely more on simply naming a current cultural topic rather than building an actual joke around it, which is a criticism that has been leveled at plenty of topical comedy across film and television, not just this franchise. That divide is very much in keeping with the larger critic versus audience split already discussed. And it is probably fair to say that how any individual viewer responds to this specific material will depend heavily on their own relationship with the broader cultural conversations the jokes are drawing from. Let's take a closer look now at some of the individual parody sequences, because that is really where the film's writing is at its sharpest. Even according to critics who were lukewarm on the overall experience. The extended sequence built around last year's acclaimed vampire drama stands out repeatedly in reviews as one of the film's strongest stretches, largely because it commits fully to recreating that film's specific atmosphere. Its music-driven emotional peaks, its tension around characters waiting just outside a threshold, before subverting all of it with the kind of broad, chaotic physical comedy this franchise has always specialized in. The joke depends entirely on the audience already having an emotional relationship with the original film's imagery, which explains why the production team went to the trouble of shooting additional footage for this and other very recent targets even after principal photography had technically wrapped. You cannot parody something effectively if the audience has not seen it yet, and by the time this film hit theaters in June, that vampire drama had already become a major awards season contender, meaning a huge share of the audience walked in already primed to recognize every visual reference being made fun of. The sequence built around a much colder, more clinical recent horror hit involving themes of body horror and transformation works a little differently, rather than recreating a specific scene beat for using practical effects and prosthetics to build toward a transformation gag that deliberately calls back to an entirely different film in the Wayans family's own filmography. That kind of self-referential joke only works for viewers who are already familiar with the studio's back catalog, which is a small but telling example of how this film is really speaking to two different audiences simultaneously. On one level, it is speaking to the general moviegoing public who just want broad horror comedy references. On another level, it is speaking directly to longtime fans of this specific family of comedians, rewarding them with deep-cut callbacks that a casual viewer might not even register as a joke at all. The amusement park sequence spoofing the Final Destination franchise is elaborate. Rube Goldberg-style death scenes gets a more mixed response in reviews, generally seen as competent but a little prey. Elaborate death has already been parodied, referenced, and memed so extensively across internet culture over the past 2 decades that there is relatively little fresh comedic ground left to cover. It is a perfectly serviceable sequence, but it lands as one of the more expected beats in a film that otherwise tries hard to feel current and unpredictable. Then there is the whole situation around the sequence spoofing the ultra-violent horror franchise centered on a killer clown character, which became something of a small controversy story in its own right during the film's promotional cycle. According to reports, an extended set piece depicting the film's take on that villain causing chaos and carnage inside a shopping mall setting played for the franchise's signature over-the-top gross-out comedy was initially cut from the film entirely over concerns about how extreme the content was, even by this franchise's historically loose standards. It was later restored in a trimmed down from after pushback, presumably from people involved in the production who felt the sequence was an important piece of the film's larger horror spoofing puzzle. That back and forth over how far is too far, even for a franchise explicitly built on pushing past good taste for a laugh, tells you something real about the tightrope this movie is walking in 2026, while also facing real financial pressure to deliver exactly the kind of transgressive, boundary-pushing comedy that made this franchise famous in the first place, and that a meaningful chunk of its audience is specifically showing up for. It is worth stepping back here and asking honestly whether all of this actually adds up to a good movie, separate from the impressive box office story surrounding it. And I think the honest answer, based on everything critics and audiences have said, is that it depends heavily on what you are personally looking for when you sit down to watch it. If you are looking for a tightly constructed screenplay with a clean, well-paced central mystery and every joke perfectly calibrated, this is probably not going to satisfy you, and the critical cons in spoofing well over a dozen different horror properties within a runtime that also has to service an actual plot, a mystery killer reveal, and multiple new characters who each need enough screen time to matter. Something has to give under that much weight, and by most accounts what gives is consistency. Some sequences land beautifully while others feel rushed or underdeveloped, and the pacing occasionally stalls out entirely when the film tries to squeeze in one more pop culture reference that has little to do with the horror genre it is otherwise focused on. But if what you are looking for is exactly what this franchise has always promised, a loud, unpretentious, communal theater experience built around recognizing recent movies and laughing at how ridiculous they can be made to look, then based on the audience reaction, this film delivers that in spades. The consistently high audience score, the specific comments people left about laughing until it hurt, about needing this kind of release, about appreciating a comedy willing to make fun of everyone equally rather than picking safe targets. All of that points to a film that understood its actual assignment, even if it did not always execute every individual joke perfectly. There is real value in a movie that gives a packed opening weekend theater crowd, shown across a striking number of countries and demographics, permission to laugh together at something silly during a period when a lot of entertainment coverage has focused on how divided and joyless cultural conversation has become. Multiple audience comments explicitly framed the movie that way, several viewers describing it as exactly what people needed in a chaotic year. Language that shows up again and again in the audience reaction, suggesting the emotional function this film served for a lot of moviegoers went beyond just being funny in a technical sense. Let's also talk briefly about where this leaves the franchise going forward, because that is clearly on everyone's mind, given how the marketing and even the credit sequences seem to be teasing possibilities without actually confirming anything. As mentioned earlier, neither of the two credit scenes sets up a direct sequel, and by most accounts that appears to be a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. A small joke about how modern franchises always assume a sequel is coming even when nothing has actually been confirmed yet. But given the box office results, a seventh film feels less like a question of if and more a question of when, especially with a $30 million budget already more than paid back within the opening weekend alone. And with the international rollout still continuing to add to that total in additional markets across the following weeks. Studios do not walk away from that kind of return on investment lightly, and the involvement of the original Wayans creative team, reunited for the first time in a quarter of a century, gives Paramount and Miramax a genuine, marketable hook for future installments that the franchise simply did not have during its middle stretch of sequels made without them. There is also a broader industry lesson buried in all of this that goes beyond just this one franchise. The success of Scary Movie arrives at a moment when a lot of entertainment industry conversation has been focused on franchise fatigue, on audiences supposedly growing tired of sequels, reboots, and legacy properties dominating theatrical release calendars. And yet here is a legacy sequel to a spoof franchise, mocking exactly that trend while simultaneously being a beneficiary of it, posting numbers that outperform plenty of far more expensive original projects released around the same time. That is not necessarily proof that franchise fatigue is a myth. Plenty of legacy sequels and reboots have genuinely underperformed in recent years. But it does suggest that audiences are not rejecting nostalgia and legacy properties wholesale. They are rejecting nostalgia and legacy properties that feel cynical, poorly made, or disconnected from what originally made people love the source material. A film that reunites the actual creative minds behind an original hit, rather than just licensing the name and handing it to an unrelated team, appears to land very differently with audiences. And that distinction is probably worth studios paying closer attention to the next time they are deciding whether to greenlight a legacy sequel or a straightforward reboot. Before wrapping up, it is worth taking one more pass at the social media conversation surrounding this release, because that online buzz genuinely shaped the film's trajectory before a single ticket was even sold. The initial trailer reaction was strong enough that the studio moved the release date up an entire week. An almost unheard of scheduling decision that speaks to just how loud and immediate the online response was. Once the film actually hit theaters, that same online energy split into two very distinct lanes that mirror the broader critic audience divide almost perfectly. On one side, clips and reaction videos, unfiltered audience laughter, and treating the theatrical experience itself as something worth documenting and sharing. The kind of organic, word-of-mouth marketing that no studio at budget can fully manufacture on its own. On the other side, a wave of critical takes and video essays, of which this one is admittedly now a part, dug into the film's structural problems, its uneven joke density, and its complicated relationship with dated versus current humor. Both conversations fed off each other, and together they kept Scary Movie trending across multiple platforms for well over a week after release, which is exactly the kind of sustained cultural presence that turns a strong opening weekend into a genuinely significant box office run rather than a one-and-done spike. Let's spend a little more time on the writing process itself, because the logistics behind this script are genuinely unusual for a studio comedy, and they help explain both the film's biggest strengths. And Keenan Ivory Wayans wrote the screenplay together with an additional co-writer, marking the first time all three brothers had worked on a script together since the second film in this franchise. Released back in 2001, that is a 25-year gap between writing collaborations. And anyone who has worked on a long-running creative partnership knows that reassembling that exact chemistry after such a long break is not guaranteed to work smoothly, even among family members who clearly still get along and clearly still share a similar comedic sensibility. By most accounts, the writing does feel unmistakably like a Wayans production, sharing the same rhythm, the same willingness to go for broad physical comedy, and the same instinct to build jokes around uncomfortable social topics that more cautious comedies tend to avoid. Whether that consistency is a strength or a limitation again depends on your relationship with the franchise's earlier work. What makes the production timeline unusual is the decision to keep rewriting and reshooting well past the point most studio comedies would have locked their script. Waiting until months before release to shoot brand new parody material aimed at horror films that had only just come out is a genuinely risky strategy. It requires enormous trust that the finished footage can be cut into the existing film cleanly, that the newly parodied films will actually resonate with audiences by release time, and that the production schedule can absorb late additions without blowing the budget, which, remember, sat at a relatively modest $30 million for the whole film. That the studio pulled this off without any major reported production disasters, and still delivered the movie on its intended release window, all while moving the date up a week rather than delaying it, speaks to a level of production confidence that is fairly rare for a comedy sequel. It also directly explains why the film feels, for better or worse, like it is chasing whatever was trending at the literal last possible moment, rather than reflecting a script that had months to breathe and get polished into something more consistently sharp. Comedy writing in general benefits enormously from revision, from testing jokes in front of audiences, and cutting the ones that do not land. And a production schedule this compressed and this reactive to real-time cultural trends leaves noticeably less room for that kind of careful refinement, which lines up almost exactly with the pacing and consistency complaints raised by critics. There is one more piece of context worth adding before we get to a final verdict. And that is how this film's opening weekend fits into the broader summer 2026 box office calendar as a whole. It did not open into a quiet marketplace. That same weekend saw a major toy-based action property debut with a much larger budget and softer results. An ultra-low-budget horror film continuing an already record-breaking run for its studio. And another modestly budgeted horror thriller still holding strong in its fourth week of release. Sitting at the very top of that particular chart, ahead of titles with vastly larger production budgets and, in some cases considerably stronger reviews. Says a lot about how much pent-up demand there apparently was for exactly this kind of nostalgic, broad comedic experience. It also highlights an interesting pattern in the 2026 box office more generally, where several of the year's biggest per-dollar success stories have come from smaller, tightly budgeted genre films rather than nine-figure blockbusters. A trend industry analysts have been tracking closely as studios reconsider how much they are willing to spend relative to what audiences are actually rewarding at the box office. It is also worth thinking briefly about what happens to a film like this after its theatrical window closes. Since box office numbers only tell part of the story for a franchise built this heavily on quotability and rewatchability. The earlier Scary Movie films have had long, healthy lives on cable television and home video, becoming exactly the kind of comfort watch comedy that people put on in the background at gatherings or return to, specifically for a handful of favorite scenes rather than watching start to finish with total focus. Given how reference-heavy this new film is, tied tightly to a very specific slice of horror movies from the past 2 or 3 years, its long-term rewatch value will likely depend heavily on how well those specific reference points continue to resonate as time passes. Joke about a currently popular horror franchise lands very differently in a few years once that franchise itself has faded from the cultural conversation, which is exactly the trade-off mentioned earlier when discussing the film's newer, identity-focused material. That is simply the nature of this kind of highly topical, reference-driven comedy, and it applies just as much to the film's more mainstream horror parody content as it does to its generational humor. That question of longevity connects to a larger tension running through the entire critical conversation around this film, which is really a tension about what comedy is even supposed to accomplish. Some critics evaluate a comedy primarily on craft, on whether the screenplay is tightly constructed, whether the pacing is well managed, whether the humor demonstrates some kind of lasting wit that will hold up on a rewatch years down the line. Other viewers, and clearly a large share of this film's opening weekend audience, evaluate comedy primarily on impact in the moment, on whether a room full of strangers laughed together, loudly and repeatedly, during the 90 minutes they spent together in a dark theater. Those are not incompatible standards. Plenty of films manage to satisfy both at once. But they are different standards, and a huge amount of the disagreement swirling around this film's reception comes down to which standard a given critic or viewer is applying without necessarily saying so directly. Reading through the range of reactions side by side, it becomes pretty clear that the reviewers focused on craft came away disappointed, while the audiences focused on communal, in-the-moment impact came away thrilled. And both groups are describing the same 90-something minutes of footage. So where does that leave us in terms of a final verdict? Scary Movie in 2026 is not a great movie by any conventional critical standard. And honestly, no film in this specific franchise ever really has been, going all the way back to the original in 2000. What it is, though, is a remarkably effective piece of populist entertainment. A movie that understood exactly what audience it needed to satisfy and delivered on that promise well enough to post genuinely historic box office numbers for a mid-budget comedy in a summer season otherwise dominated by nine-figure blockbusters. It succeeds specifically where it leans hardest into what made the original films beloved in the first place. The reunited chemistry of its original for leads, fearless, no-holds-barred parody of very current horror trends, and a willingness to go for broad, communal laughs without worrying too much about whether every single joke will still land in 5 years. It struggles specifically where it tries to do too much at once, chasing every trending reference simultaneously instead of trusting its strongest central parody, and sidelining the very cast chemistry that made people nostalgic for it in the first place. One more angle worth exploring is how the film's marketing rollout itself became part of the story, almost as much as the movie's content did. Long before release, the studio leaned heavily into treating the trailer drops as events rather than routine promotional beats, timing the first teaser to play in front of another major horror sequel already drawing huge theater crowds, ensuring it reached exactly the audience most likely to recognize every reference packed into it. Once that footage hit social platforms, it spread with the kind of organic momentum studios usually have to pay heavily to manufacture, driven largely by clips highlighting the most recognizable parody moments, the vampire drama sequence, the killer doll riff, the exaggerated slasher chase scenes, edited into short, shareable bursts perfectly suited for algorithm-driven platforms. That kind of trailer virality used to be somewhat unpredictable, but this rollout followed a pattern that has become increasingly common for genre films aimed at younger audiences. Releasing footage dense enough with individually clippable, meme-ready moments that fans do the marketing team's job for them simply by reacting to it online. The fact that this response was strong enough to move an already set release date up by a full week is a genuinely rare outcome, and it speaks to just how efficiently that trailer strategy worked at generating real anticipation rather than passive awareness. It is also useful to look at how different types of outlets covered this film differently, because that split maps almost perfectly onto the larger critic audience divide already discussed at length. Entertainment, trade publications and box office trackers covered the film almost entirely through the lens of its financial performance, treating the opening weekend numbers as the headline story and treating the reviews as a secondary footnote. Film criticism outlets, on the other hand, largely centered their coverage on the screenplay's structural weaknesses, its pacing problems, and its uneven joke density, treating the box office success as almost beside the point when evaluating the film purely as a piece of writing and direction. Entertainment, gossip, and fan-facing outlets split the difference, covering both angles but leaning heavily into audience reaction content, quoting the enthusiastic comments left by moviegoers and framing the film's reception as a feel-good underdog story of regular audiences overriding professional critics. Reading coverage across all three types of outlets side by side gives a much more complete picture than any single source could offer on its own, which is really the whole reason a breakdown like this one is useful in the first place, pulling together the box office data, the critical reaction, and the audience response into one place rather than treating any single piece of that puzzle as the whole story. If you are trying to decide whether this movie is actually worth your time, it helps to ask yourself a few honest questions first. Do you have real affection for the original to films, the ones the Wayans family wrote themselves? Or did your relationship with this franchise mostly come from the sequels made after they left? Are you generally the kind of moviegoer who enjoys watching horror movies specifically so you can then watch them get mocked shortly afterward? Meaning you have probably already seen most of the dozen-plus films being referenced here? And maybe most importantly, are you looking for a tightly written piece of comedic filmmaking? Or are you looking for the specific, communal experience of sitting in a crowded theater and laughing loudly at something deliberately dumb alongside a room full of strangers who showed up for the exact same reason you did? If your answers lean toward nostalgia, familiarity with recent horror, and a preference for loud, communal comedy over careful screenwriting, this film is very likely to deliver exactly what you are hoping for, and the audience numbers back that up clearly. If your answers lean the other way, toward wanting something tightly constructed and consistently sharp from beginning to end, you are much more likely to walk away agreeing with the critical consensus instead. It is also worth acknowledging that this film exists at an interesting crossroads for the horror comedy genre more broadly. Horror itself has never been more commercially dominant, consistently delivering some of the best return on investment of any genre in modern theatrical release. Which is part of why studios keep greenlighting horror films, even when overall box office attendance struggles elsewhere. Comedy, meanwhile, has struggled more than almost any other major genre to draw people into theaters over the past several years, with a lot of comedic content migrating toward streaming platforms and short-form video instead. A film that manages to sit at the intersection of those two genres, borrowing horror's proven theatrical pull while still delivering a full comedic experience, occupies a genuinely useful commercial niche. One that this franchise essentially pioneered back in 2000, and one that this sixth entry has now proven still works a quarter of a century later. That alone makes this film worth paying attention to as an industry case study, separate from any judgment about whether any individual joke inside it actually lands. Ultimately, the gap between the critical score and the audience score tells the real story here better than any single review could. This is a film built for the theater experience itself, for the specific feeling of sitting in a packed room and laughing along with strangers at something deliberately, unapologetically silly, rather than for the more solitary, analytical experience of watching critically and picking apart plot mechanics after the fact. Whether that makes it a successful film really depends on which of those two experiences you value more when you walk into a theater. And based on the box office results alone, a whole lot of people around the world walked in wanting exactly the first one. Looking back across all 6 films in this franchise now, a pretty clear shape emerges. The first 2 entries, written and directed by the family that created the whole concept, are generally remembered as the sharpest and most beloved, even with mixed critical scores at the time. The middle stretch, made without that original team steering the ship, is generally remembered as a decline, hitting its lowest point with the 5th film. And now this 6th entry arrives as a direct response to that decline. An attempt to prove that the specific, creative chemistry present in the first of films can still generate something worth watching a quarter of a century later, based on the box office numbers and the audience reaction. That attempt largely succeeded on its own terms, even if the critical reviews suggest the writing itself did not fully recapture the sharper focus of those earliest entries. That is the real story behind the numbers, behind the reviews, and behind the trailer that got so much attention it moved its own release date up a week. 26 years after For Friends first ran from a killer in a ghost face mask. The joke still works for a huge number of people, even if it does not work for everyone. And in the middle of 2026, that turned out to be more than enough to put this franchise firmly back on the map.
Eclipse motion. Motion pictures. Entertainment.